after like 5 minutes, I heard screaming, people screaming, and cars rushing. I rushed to the place. I found people carrying other people who seems for the first sight seemed like dead.
For example, when they destroyed these Palestinian villages and towns that Faisal talked about that you can see inside, they destroyed also the trees around them, whether domesticated trees or wild trees, and they planted pine trees in place of those. This is replacement agriculture.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to the Struggle Video News. Monday, August 21st, we'll see demonstrations, vigils, and rallies around the world to remember the sarin gas attack that murdered 1,400 people 10 years ago in Ghouta, Syria. Different parts of that Damascus suburb were attacked on that day. Moadamiyah was one of them. 3 years after the attack, I interviewed Danny Kapani, who was in Moadamiyah, Syria. This is part of the audio-only interview I did with him that day. Now, Moadamiyah had been in international news in 2013, in August, during the chemical weapons attack. Were you there that day?
Yes, of course I was there.
Can you describe what happened?
For me personally, I was at the office, something like at the dawn. I heard a strange sound, something like toot, toot. I just went straight away to the roof of the building where I was, where the office is, and just tried to listen where the sound is coming from. It was coming from the west, from Damascus, the city, and I, after like 5 minutes, I heard screaming, people screaming, and cars rushing. I rushed to the place. I found people carrying other people who seems for the first sight seemed like dead, children, women, and men. Then after that, I went to the field hospital. I saw hundreds of bodies all over the place. It was shocking. It was the first thing to see in my life, to see hundreds of bodies dead. And my eyes went, I saw my uncle and his son and his 5 kids also on the floor. Some of them were like shaking and foaming from the mouth, and the other were just like dead. I tried not to cry, but I couldn't. And after that, I just held my camera to film. And at that time, I didn't know anything about my family. I don't know what's their situation. I tried to call them, but there was no signal in the field hospital. I used internet to talk to my fiance out of the city, to call them on phone, just to tell me how they are. Are they still alive, or were they still alive? She called them and then sent me a message on WhatsApp that they are okay, but my 2 brothers are are something like can't move, because they were helping people, evacuating people from the place, and they needed needles to be okay. I took needles, injections from the hospital to my brothers, and then went to film in the streets, and then went to the media centers office with my friends to share what we filmed to the world. After that day, I can't describe my feelings now, because every time I try to remember that day, the scenes and the faces, the cries, the moanings of people. Every time I try to remember them, words stuck into my mouth. I'm just speechless now about that.
I'm so sorry to have to bring it all up. How many people died in Muadamiyah from the chemicals?
64.
64 people. And again, I'm embarrassed to say this, but you know, in the West, in the United States, there's a good number of people who say this was a plot. It wasn't the obvious. Who do the people in the city think did this chemical attack?
Before the chemical attacks, we had news from a person in the Assad army that he told us that you should take care, because there is something dangerous gonna happen to Mu'addamiyah. He didn't say what was to happen, but he said so. And of course, we have no enemy. We have no enemy. But Assad and his army and his militias and Hezbollah, who's gonna hit us with chemicals? Who had chemicals but Assad?
That interview took place in Mu'addamiyah after a years-long siege that resulted in Assad forces driving out the forces of the Syrian revolution. Again, rallies and vigils will take place on Monday the 21st in many cities around the world, including Washington, D.C., New York City, and Hartford, Connecticut. These are the slogans that will be on banners at the Hartford event, which will remember the victims and call for full access for food and supplies to Idlib, Syria, and for freedom for Assad's thousands of political prisoners. It will be held near the Old State House at noon on Monday the 21st. Set your GPS to 1 Market Street. Parking on the street or in a garage a block up on that Market Street. Details at pepeace.org. By the way, supporters of Ukrainians are especially welcome at the event. Assad has been, for years, Putin's underling. Here's an older photo of Syrians in New York City opposite the Russian consulate, reminding the Russians of the sarin gas massacre. We'll start our coverage of Palestine with 2 pieces of outrageous news. The first concerns with what Israel calls a pre-military academy. These are military training centers, part of the Israeli state, that are run by rabbis. The head of one of these academies, Rabbi Tzvi Kostener, recently spoke at an event and called for the release of the killer of a Palestinian family. This is the family that the killer burned alive. Kostener called the killer's detention one of the greatest injustices. The second involves this picture. Israeli police raided Shoafat refugee camp and, according to the man arrested, beat him all over his body and left this imprint of a Jewish star on his face below his eye. Now, Dr. Mazin Qumsiyeh, director of the Palestine Institute of Biodiversity and Sustainability in Bethlehem of the West Bank, as he spoke at the Palestine Museum U.S. in Woodbridge, Connecticut.
So who are these 2 gentlemen? Does anybody know here? This is just from this week, a picture from this week. This is Yair Lapid, Israeli
guy from the
leader
Emirates.
and the foreign minister of the United Arab Emirates, having a cozy couch conversation.
That's the guy who was acting funny when he was trying to sign the agreement. He didn't know what to do. He was doing like Mr. Bean, you know, looking the guy next to him.
Yeah. So why did I put this picture here? This is very, I was just thinking, what is it that about us Palestinians that make us this close to the mental institution? You live in a world where global kind of relationships and power struggles and whatever makes people focus on people like this and the billions of dollars that are spent in the United Arab Emirates. I don't know if you heard this, Faisal, they are building a natural history museum. And the amount of space that they are doing is 150,000 square meters, which is like half a million square foot. And the buildings alone is costing like $500 million or $1 billion. And then of course they hired all these consultants from abroad to bring them all these objects that they were gonna go buy whole dinosaurs from elsewhere, put them in there, on bids on Sotheby's or something, dinosaurs. And here, Faisal and I did museums basically with on our own with that. And
we'll sell them some dinosaurs.
The content is what's important in museum. It's not having fancy, buildings and stuff like that. So anyways, but this is the power systems that we are facing. We're facing entrenched power systems in the world that run the world and tell us what to do, when to do it, how to do it, and what to believe about certain things, and they guide our thinking. As a collective, as a people. And what we try to do in extremely difficult circumstances is do something different and show you something different. And if you got a chance, came earlier and took a tour around this museum with nice art and stuff from Palestine, you may have gotten a different perspective about Palestine. And certainly if you come to Palestine, you will, now I cannot change the screen. There we go. So what we face in the world is something very difficult. And I don't want to spend too much time talking about politics. Stan is better at this than I am in talking about what's happening in Ukraine or elsewhere. I do want to talk about Palestine very briefly in terms of medical, my background is medical genetics. And medical genetics, we say you have to take a patient history, take the symptoms, make the right diagnosis, offer therapy, and then look at prognosis, what's going to happen in the future. Those are the 5 pillars of modern medicine, of course. And the same applies for social phenomena. Now, why do we need to talk about the patient history briefly? Is to understand whether the condition that we have, this problem that we have, is congenital, or is it like COVID-19 comes and goes, everybody gets it. And this is important, of course, to give the therapy and the prognosis. So let's say just a few words about this patient. The patient is called Palestine. It's a geographic area known by that name for 3,500 years, by the way. Not as the Zionists like us to believe that the Romans gave us our names. It's like saying, some alien gave the name to the United States or something. It's really, that's the name that I was known for 3,000. It's a province of the land of Canaan. The land of Canaan, of course, is this part that is at the intersection of continents, as you see there. That's where humans migrated out of Africa to the rest of the world from. So actually your ancestors are also Palestinians, Canaanites, if you want. And if you want it. I don't know that that's necessarily a big privilege, but anyways, even birds migrate through Palestine from Eurasia and Africa. Annually, 500 million birds migrate through Palestine. What is this area and what happened in it is because it's at the intersection of continent, because it's geology, like the lowest point on Earth, the Dead Sea and high mountains, it had rich biodiversity. And this rich biodiversity, for example, we have more plant species than there are in England, and we are a very small country, you know, compared to England. But this rich biodiversity also allowed it to have to be part of the Fertile Crescent, where we humans, your ancestors and mine, developed agriculture. And this was about 12,000 years ago in this area. Jericho is, for example, the oldest continuously inhabited town on Earth. When people invented agriculture, they had time on their hands, so they invented also other things like the alphabet and laws and democracy and other things that now people speak about here, you know, rule of law, etc. This was all started in the Fertile Crescent long before the Greeks, long before the Romans and all of these things. 75% of the people of the Fertile Crescent lived off of agriculture, sustainable, basically, what do you call it, sustenance agriculture, so they lived off the land. Of course, in Palestine, this is no longer the case because we had Zionism and the problems, so we had to change. But anyways, this is the patient. It's a healthy country with lots of rich resources, rich agriculture. In the Bible, it's mentioned as the land of milk and honey, etc. This very rich land that survived for thousands of years, 12,000 of years on sustainable agriculture and animal husbandry, was transformed in the past 100 years dramatically. So, for example, instead of 75% of the Palestinians living off of sustaining agriculture, only 3 or 4% now live off of sustaining agriculture. And this 12,000 years of history, the patient was very healthy, no problems, no wars, no conflicts, except on occasional episodes, like the Crusaders a few hundred years ago, like this conflict here. But between those rare conflicts, there was peace there. Palestine is one of the most peaceful countries on earth, believe it or not. Palestine was also a diverse country, multi-ethnic, multicultural, multi-religious, even multilingual. Before 1948, there were 44 languages spoken in Palestine. This is a picture from Palestine 1932, when religious, secular, and religious leaders met in Jerusalem to object to the Balfour Declaration. And you can see the diversity just looking at the faces of these people. You know, Ethiopian Christian Palestinians, Armenians, Orthodox Christians, etc. This is the diversity of languages and cultures and secular people also. So if this is the case, if the patient does not have a congenital problem, then what is the problem now? The problem now is very simple. I don't have too much time to go into it in detail. But basically, there was an idea called political Zionism that kind of quickly took over a segment of European Jews. This is as opposed to, let's say, religious Zionism and cultural Zionism, where people want to just go live there or whatever. Political Zionism is an idea that said we want a Jewish state with Jewish army, with Jewish airplanes, with Jewish everything, Jewish land, Jewish this, Jewish that. Well, there is a tiny little problem you face, which is that 97% of the people in that country were not Jewish. 3% were only Jewish. This is late 19th century. So how are you going to take a country that's multi-ethnic, multicultural, multi-religious, multilingual, and make it the Jewish state of Israel with one language, one culture, one uniformity? This is the conundrum, as I say, bigger than the problem. It is not a small problem. Well, the answer was very obvious, which is ethnic cleansing. So 530 Palestinian villages, which you see on the map there, and red dots, were ethnically cleansed, and Palestinians were made refugees, and today 8 million of us are refugees or displaced people. And the rest live in Bantustans.
In the next room, there's a map on the floor that shows all those villages, and it's color-coded.
Yeah.
And on the side,
That's
there's a
great.
list of
So you
every
can take
village
a
and the
look at
date it was cleansed. Sorry to interrupt.
And Israel was created on 78% of Palestine, and then 1967 occupied the rest, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and proceeded to repeat the same process. So you can see on the right map the Jewish colonies built on Palestinian land. This is a process that happened over the years, over the past 75 years, a process of taking Palestine and converting it to a Jewish state. So it's not like there's a conflict, as sometimes the West likes to say, you know, Jewish-Arab conflict or Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Really, we don't have a conflict. Conflict is when you and your neighbor have an issue with the fence or something. This is not a conflict. This is a colonialism which happened through a process, and this process is ongoing as we speak. Even last week, demolishing homes, taking over lands, etc. And this process should be familiar to all of you from what happened in the United States here with the shrinking land left for Native Americans. In fact, the shrinking map of Palestine came because my son saw the shrinking map of the United States at the bottom, and he decided to draw a map for me in 1998 when he was 13 years old of the shrinking map of Palestine. This is the diagnosis, as we say, or the etiology of the disease. It's called settler colonialism, and settler colonialism is very well known, and its symptoms are very well known to you and to everybody. And it is important to make the right diagnosis of this issue. Now, the symptoms of settler colonialism, that's why you really have to make the right diagnosis. The symptoms of settler colonialism are many, many, and I don't have time to go through them, whether it's the killings, whether it's violence, whether it's the walls, whether it's the settlements, whether it's the torture, the jailing of children, for example, etc. The only symptom I do want to talk about a little bit at length is the environmental symptom, which globally we have an environmental crisis. This iconic picture of the giraffes that are dead in the savannah, 6 giraffes, always haunts me. I sometimes dream about it because, wildlife is being decimated at amazing speeds around the world because of the human produced activities, climate change, habitat destruction, pollution, overexploitation of resources, invasive species, and of course settler colonialism. Settler colonialism is an important aspect of this. By the way, when you go back to this picture and look at it, I always ponder this picture because it shows, the West bringing civilization, technology, light, and those savages, the Native Americans, are running away. And what's also running away, by the way, is buffaloes. And the Europeans killed, I don't know the number, but it was like millions of buffaloes to deny the natives basically their food source. This is the kind of environmental damage that colonialists do. And I was recently doing a research on the designation of nature reserves in the context of colonialism. And it turns out that this is a common phenomenon, that colonialists use the designation of nature reserve to exclude the indigenous people. So in the case of Israel, they designate nature reserves to exclude the Palestinians. In the case of Yellowstone Park, to exclude the Native Americans, etc. This is a common phenomenon. But anyway, there is a lot of symptoms associated with settler colonialism relating to the environment. For example, when they destroyed these Palestinian villages and towns that Faisal talked about, that you can see inside, they destroyed also the trees around them, whether domesticated trees or wild trees, and they planted pine trees in place of those. This is replacement agriculture. And replacement agriculture, you know, again, iconic that you are replacing a polyculture with a monoculture. Just like you're replacing a polytheist, you know, multi-ethnic, multicultural, multi-religious society with one society. The problem with pine trees is, of course, that they are European trees, more adapted to European climates. And in our summers, which get very hot, they are more susceptible to fires. And so they really have devastating fires that are ongoing now in the Galilee, by the way. This past week, there's been fires in the Galilee in the pine forests. And in this case, by the way, when the pine forest burned, it exposed the terraces that the Palestinians had built and had planted other kinds of trees in there.
More of Dr. Qumsiyeh's talk next week, but we again want to show the photo of Mohammed Tamimi as was displayed at the museum on August 8th, and the number of days since a sniper shot the 2-year-old to death in Nabi Saleh. That's our program for today. See you next week at this time. I'm Stanley Heller for the Struggle Video News.